Hello again, everyone. Welcome to another mini episode of the Man v Mob podcast. I just recorded another one called Muddying the Racial Waters, so definitely check that one out. But this one is about things to come, basically how things might go down over the next couple months through the election cycle, I'd say. I like to think a lot about the past, the present, the future, really the immediate future, the further future. I like to kind of create these simulations in my head of where I think things could go and get a fairly higher level understanding of trends that are occurring rather than just things that specific people say. Trump said this, Pelosi said this, whatever. I like daily news is largely uninteresting to me. I want to learn about bigger things that are going on in the background. So these are some things that, particularly because I'm a history buff, things that I've noticed from the past, things that might occur again or in a slightly different way. I believe that COVID is equivalent to what the assassination of Franz Ferdinand was back during the early years of the 20th century. So back in 1917, if you're unfamiliar with history, Franz Ferdinand was assassinated. He was a Serbian archduke, and he basically, his assassination led to this descent into global war, into World War I, because of the alliances that existed at the time. I don't think that we're about to go into global war per se. What I do think is that people are looking at COVID right now as if it's the main event, as if it is, wow, we just conquered COVID, or we're on the verge of conquering COVID, and isn't that crazy? I think COVID is the pin that pops the bubble, and the bubble that I think is popping this time is going to be student debt. Back in 2008, we had another bubble, and it was housing debt. And there was this notion of, if we push housing on people who really can't afford it as their ticket to the American dream, then we can create this basically Ponzi economy of debt where a bunch of people are making money off of it and it's unsustainable. Eventually it collapses, and really the people at the top who are making money out of it can, in a lot of cases, create golden parachutes for themselves or get bailouts in that case. And the people who suffer are the ones who were lured into the debt trap, or who weren't even part of the debt trap and who lost their savings, or who had to basically weather a terrible economy for years. So it affected Wall Street differently than it affected Main Street, as you might have heard. And you had all these resulting movements like Occupy Wall Street, and I think that this time you have a very similar thing where it's the institutions of higher education who have been selling a compromised product, an inflated product, as the ticket to the American dream, and it costs somebody $250,000 to get a full credential degree, and it was unsustainable. A lot of universities and other stakeholders, whether it was uh, financial stakeholders or whether it was people in different parts of the education establishment or education industry, because it is an industry now, made their money, and now it's collapsing. And this is the thing that is going to, COVID is the thing that is going to cause defaults. It's going to increasingly pile up these defaults, and it's going to cause the economy to start to collapse. And at some point, there's going to be an attempt to do a bailout similar to the bank bailout that was done in 2008 for the banks that had traded the debt that was accumulated from the subprime mortgages that were lent out to people who didn't have uh, a subprime mortgage. I should do, as a side note, is a mortgage that's lent out to basically somebody who doesn't have the criteria that would otherwise allow them to take on a mortgage. You know, maybe they have a bad credit rating, maybe they don't have much collateral. These subprime mortgages were extended and pushed beyond what would have been smart in the normal circumstances to people who really didn't have the financial means of taking on these expensive assets. And they were relying primarily, this is called a Ponzi borrow, when you can't pay back the principal or the interest without relying on the growth in the value of the asset that you've taken on. So it was purely hoping that the houses continued to grow in value. And what was causing those houses to grow in value was more debt and more inflation in the economy. So eventually it pops, just like a Ponzi scheme, like Bernie Madoff's scheme. It pops. You no longer have people that can be put in downstream who can float the money and put it up the pyramid. So the danger that we're in right now is that the experience from 2008 is that these banks had bailouts, and the average American didn't see any benefit from the bailouts, or at least anything that is visible. There might be background things that you can't really pinpoint, but the notion that these people caused the economy to collapse and then were effectively rewarded for it, that is still in the memory of most people who saw their tax dollars put towards bailing people out, reckless people. And so this time, when a bailout is put forward for another massively reckless fraud, which is equivalent to the selling of indulgences by the Catholic Church back in the, I don't know, the 16th century. And once again, if you're unfamiliar with that, basically the Catholic Church was trying to sell pardons, access to heaven, access to God. And Martin Luther came out and said, whoa, 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 whoa. We don't need you as an institution, as a middleman between us and God. We can connect with God ourselves and interpret the Bible ourselves. That's what higher education is today. It's saying, like, we can give you career and education access and this credential that says that you're smart, and that's not necessarily that you don't need to pay $250,000 to demonstrate that you're smart. It's a ridiculous proposition, and people are realizing how much of a racket it is and how full of shit the higher education institutions are. So the result of the animosity from '08 and the animosity of today is going to result in popular pushback against the notion of bailing out the institutions of higher education, because we already did that, and it's like a devil's bargain, basically. And it's bailing out people who don't deserve it, quite frankly. And people are going to say, you know what, this time, let's let the institutions fall apart. Now, that is going to cause institutions to be increasingly desperate, and they're going to probably start to make deals with companies and other entities that are going to try to buy them up at, or buy up parts of them at fire sale prices. Not to mention, people are already really considering alternatives to classic brick and mortar higher education, because COVID has forced these institutions to create, in earnest for the first time, alternative online versions of the curriculums. So going to an institution no longer really proves that you're actually intelligent. It just says, I have a thing that says that I'm smart. Like a marriage certificate doesn't prove that you're in love. It just says, I am legally obligated towards this person. Um, so I think that we need to be careful, because if and when the economy, well, I say it's a when, not an if. I'm pretty convinced that shit's going to go downhill, and that the debt that has accumulated over the last 7 decades is entirely unsustainable, and that technology has a deflationary effect where the debt has an inflationary effect, and that a lot of people are relying on the institutions that have existed continuing to exist, and the debt continuing to be pumped out in the form of new dollars that create inflation and continue to raise the value of assets like homes and portfolios. And there's going to be a push against that. This is talked about in the book called The Price of Tomorrow by Jeff Booth, which I definitely recommend. There's a counter push by technology, which is basically deflating the value of money, because you can get more for your money because you can make things more efficiently. So you're going to see generational conflict, definitely. You're going to see economic collapse, and you're going to see, at some point, temptation by a lot of companies, by a lot of individuals, to try to profit from provocation and war. This has happened before. This happened in the 20th century, where you go through this depression, which is a decade long, and then it started in 29, and then you start to think, you know what, getting into a war wouldn't be so bad for business, and you can profiteer from war. And if you've seen the movie War Dogs, you can basically, even if you're not a big industry, you can, as an individual or somebody who has connections, you can profit from war and conflict and other people's death. So there's going to be increasing, I would say, increasing temptation to try to get into war and conflict. And the biggest actor, aside from the United States on the world stage right now, is China. And that would be a mistake to try to start a war between the United States and China. So you have to think about how during the 20, sorry, not 20, and during the Great Depression, going to war, global war, World War II, was really what brought the country out of the Depression. Although some people want to claim it's the New Deal programs, it was largely the profiteering from the war economy and keeping that going with the consumer model that was created after the war ended. So we need to think about new ways in which we can have our economic engine be floated, and in which we can replace old institutions with new networks and new technology. Technology, investing in it properly, can really create much cheaper lifestyles for people and create a lifestyle of access rather than having to own everything. So it's sort of killing two birds with one stone, not having to rely on going to wars for resources. Like if you can maybe print things with 3D printers at home rather than having to secure resources in global supply chains. And also it will prevent the ownership consumer model that has existed for the last 70 years, which has been terrible for the environment and insisted that everybody needs to own numerous houses, numerous cars, numerous everything. It's been terrible for the environment. It's been terrible for the economy. It's been terrible for humans, pretty much, probably our health and everything. So if we reconsider all of this, then we can avoid repeating what has happened before. Although we're still going to have to go through a lot of discomfort to get to this point, we can create something brand new, something that's networked, something that's technological, something that is future oriented, but we'll actually be solving the debt bomb, the environmental bomb, all of the things that have built up, all of these debts that have built up over the last 80 years. We need to intervene and do something about the debt. So that is what I will say is likely to occur in the near and further future. We're going to have to really think about our sacrifices, about what we're willing to give up, what we're willing to ration, what we're willing to do for others, what our morals and principles are. These are conversations that need to happen right now, because this is the seedbed of starting to plan for what is on the other side of this crisis that we are going through, in which we will be going through for the next 5 to 10 years. And we need to think about how this is going to interact with the politics, the brutal, nasty, media-fueled politics of today, which encourages both sides to hate each other and profits off of that. And we need to consider how this is going to interact with the elections, and how probably this economic downturn is going to coincide with the elections and a resurgence in the second wave of the virus of COVID, and how that's going to result in people trying to turn towards a more law and order, safety, authoritarian, demagogue type person, aka Donald Trump, and um, and what the impacts are going to be in the longer term, particularly as older politicians from a prior era try to reconstruct an earlier notion of a secure America, of a 1950s, 1980s America that had far different demographics, far different technology, that had institutions that are no longer relevant or needed today. Let's talk.